Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of the Indica Books Open House with Otis. We invite you to send your writing pieces if you're interested in getting feedback and improving and learning the art of writing, the craft of writing. And in these sessions, this is what we do based on the pieces you have submitted. Otis will critique them, review them, discuss them, and we invite all of you to join in. Watch some of the pieces, read some of the pieces that have been submitted, listen to Otis talk about these topics, and you are more than welcome to ask questions, to clarify doubts, to basically, I think, interact with each other and learn. With that, Otis, over to you.
Okay, thanks. So we just have a couple pieces today, so I think we'll be a little bit on the shorter side. And since I feel like we're going to be a little on the short side, I figured, Madhavi, I would ask you. I think you were here 2 weeks ago, and I put out the mandate of writing every day, and I was wondering how you did.
I started keeping the journal as you had asked us to, and I find myself more regular. I'll show you.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I actually find myself quite regular now. I'm working on 2 pieces, and I have to submit them in 2 weeks' time. So here's
Okay,
my
let me
journal.
see. Let me see the journal.
Wait.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's good.
That is
So
amazing.
less days being off writing, more of writing these days.
Yeah,
Partly because my kids have started going to school as well, so I get more time.
All you need is 5 minutes in order to jot something down, so
Exactly.
that's the minimum, and
So
everyone has 5
on an
minutes.
average, I'm writing for 40 minutes per day now.
Yeah, but don't worry about that.
Huh.
It's very important, actually. So I think like writing is very much like everything else. I used to run quite a bit, and I'm a little bit compulsive, go figure.
Yeah.
And I would go out and I would run, and then the next day I would try and run more, and then or faster. And then the next day more and faster, more and faster, more and faster. And then pretty soon there was a day that came that I was like, I don't want to run, and I did not want to do it. And I stopped. And then it seemed so hard to start again to run at the level that I was at before I stopped. So I don't run the next day. And now I'm not running anymore. So we have to remember that no matter how much we start to drive, push ourselves, that really we're always just looking for 5 minutes a day. Madhavi, I'm so happy you kept the journal, because now you're going to know something that everyone else who hasn't done it does not know. Okay, we write a bunch of stuff, but for me, I don't do it anymore because I really do write every day, but maybe I should go back to it because I love my journal. I love it. This is the most important thing I write every day. It becomes the dominant thing. All I want to do is write that, and I love looking at it. I would love, I would be like, look, the whole page is filled up, and I would take other little notes. They're meaningless. I never look at them, but I really started to get into making the little notes and, recording this and that. It becomes your most important thing, and that is exactly what you want. What's important is not what you write. What you write is something you're working on. You're getting words on the page. Words on the page mean you have something then to look at with fresh eyes from a distance and start to improve. That's what we're doing. It's very hard to get those first words on the page. It's actually easier to look at words and then rewrite them than it is to write the words to start with. But we don't worry about that so much because all we really want to do is write whatever it is. May 1st, 9 a.m. to 9:05, and then I always give myself a little check mark too. That's what I give check mark. And then the other thing is that if I don't write for some reason, I just write no writing, and I understand that I had to rest. So just like if I was running every day, if I didn't run someday, instead of thinking, oh, I didn't run, I think I'm resting. Resting is when you build your muscles. It's the same thing with writing. Well, Madhavi, I'm very proud of you for doing that. That's awesome.
Thank you.
I know you now know what I'm talking about. So let's check in with Ashvani, see how he did.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Ashvani. How did you do on you did it? Oh my goodness. Oh, I'm so happy. See,
I don't know whether you can read
what does
it.
it say?
So I started writing on the 18th of April, and every day I wrote. So the first three readings that you see there, the first three entries, they are for an article I was writing for a professional journal.
Okay.
And after that, I was out from the 21st to the 28th. And then when I came back, I wrote again. And so if I discount the days that I was out of Bangalore and away from my laptop, then I have averaged about 600 words per day.
Okay. Now let's check with Abhinav.
Let me pull up my journal. I don't have a paper journal, but it's I am that way. Okay, so I'll pull up one. So there are basically two writing projects that are going on, and I can tell you. Okay, so for 19th, 20th, 21st, 23rd, 24th, 27th, 29th, 30th, 30th, and 1st, which is today, that is on for one project, and for the other one it is what is this, on the 15th, 23rd, 24th, and 26th. So between the 18th and 19th of April to this day, I think I've probably not written for about 2 or 3 days, but I've written for about 10 or 11 of those days of those 2 weeks.
Nice. Okay, good. Awesome. I don't get not having, like, this little thing is becomes so valuable. This is like my little Bible. This is like the most important thing I have. It's like precious. So I don't understand keeping it in the virtual world when I love to just be able to hold it, and be like, it's like my security blanket. Well, it's great. Okay, so I am going to encourage you, and I'm gonna point to Ashvani with this. So, what I would like you, so you have professional work. I do not write in this. Like, I don't keep track of writing emails or doing professional work or doing, let's say, writing a course. Make it the journal for your creative work. So that means that you're touching down on your creative work every single day. There's not a day you don't touch down on your creative work. And reviews I see a little bit differently. So I might put reviews into professional work, because I really want you to cultivate that creative work. The poetry, yes. Essays, personal essays, yes. And fiction, yes. And Ashvani, you definitely need to be working on your fiction every single day. So that is clearly a huge strength of yours, and I hope you'll do that. But fantastic! I am so happy. It's really. I used to joke that I was going to put on my gravestone, write for 5 minutes a day. That was going to be the thing. That was my contribution to the world. Now I think it's going to be like born, 1963, wrote, and then died. I think that might be it. I've also thought about maybe it being Avenge Me, but that was sort of a joke and ironic. I didn't want people to take it seriously. Avenge Me. Avenge Me. Anyway, fantastic. Okay, Ashvani, let's talk about your poem. We have your poem, we have Ram, and we have Vandana. I don't know if Vandana is here. I don't see her right now. So, Ashvani. Okay. Ashvani, tell us, why don't you... I like some parts of this poem. I like the ending. You know, it's so short and we have time. Ashwani, you want to read it?
Sure. Will you put it out on your screen or should I read out from my laptop?
Yeah, whichever is best for you. I mean, oh, sorry, I'm going to share it. Sorry.
Okay. Should I?
And by the way, we have Ram also who has joined us. He should be joining as a panelist any second now, and there he is.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I'll move it down for you, Ashwani, when we get there.
Okay. Should I?
Yeah.
This is a poem called The Passing of a Poem. My poem died young. The pulse, the rhythm, the life, all perished in unison. The poem shrugged and sighed and quietly died. They pronounced the verdict. Syllabic hemorrhage. We are sorry. The temple priest had nothing but scorn for something out of self-pity born, and said, I am sorry. Why soil a sacred pyre? Let your agony serve as the holy fire. The church said no place for something baptized in a poet's tears. We are sorry. At the crematorium, they shot me sidelong glances and groped beneath an ink-spotted tabletop, refusing to be bribed by a couple of couplets. They said, we are sorry. There is still a sliver of hope. I hold out my poem to you. Maybe, just maybe, your reading it will give it meaning and make it breathe again.
Very, very nice, Ashwani. I particularly like, I saw on your journal that you have the poem, and I like the idea, particularly if you got to the computer and you're like, oh boy, I need to write something. I need to get something done for the workshop. And you just let your fingers do their thing. You let your hands go. So I think that that's great. And this is a first draft of a poem. I have written some poetry. It's not what I generally write, but there was a period of time when I was getting my PhD, I was so sick of doing fiction workshops that I did a lot of poetry workshops, and I was very, very fortunate to work with a wonderful poet named Art Smith at the University of Tennessee, who was just amazing and basically blew my mind and expanded my work in ways that were really important to me and have been for the rest of my life. So I have a deep, love of poetry and the form, and I did write some poetry during that period that I published. So I'm going to say that poets are like, do you know those sociological experiments like the plains people and the mountain people? I forget who did them, but it basically, like, the plains people, they had a lot of things and they were friendly and nice to each other. And the mountain people had a dearth of things and they were extremely warlike and aggressive. Do you remember that, Ashwani?
No, I haven't heard of it.
Okay, well, it's basically this idea: when you have a lot, you can be generous, but when you have a little, then you're not. And so this is the difference between fiction writers who are down here on the plain. A lot of people love reading fiction. Poets, they don't have very much, and they're very vicious with each other. So I cannot claim to have risen to the high mountain top of poetry where I'm able to, criticize your syntactical structure and your syllabic rhythms and all of that stuff in some kind of critical way. I just have very simple ways of looking at poetry. My simple ways have allowed me to publish some poetry, but that's all I can offer you, Ashwani. So you have something on the page, and I think that you actually get to something that's kind of interesting here in this poem. We come into a poem with a kind of conceit, and here you start with it's sort of like an ode to the poem itself. A failed poem. It's a little I don't know what you would call that. I mean, it's like self-defeating. You don't want to write the poem. You figure you're not a poet and you're going to fail no matter what anyway. So write a poem about a failed writing of a poem. I get it. But you get to something kind of interesting here where in each of these stanzas, the poem is rejected by someone. You know, it's like, it's not, you know, it's like the poem wants to die, right? The poem wants to die, but it wants, you know, one of these ritual occurrences to take place that will allow it to pass into the other world and be forgotten. But it's not allowed, right? Every place that this person goes, he goes to the priest. You know, the priest rejects it. You know, will not send it to the afterworld. The church will not send it to the afterworld. The crematorium will not even burn it down to send it to the afterworld. You know, to make it disappear. And that actually brings up an idea that I think is really fascinating. Is that it kind of can't disappear, right? Once it's been made, it can't disappear. I mean, it exists. You've gone someplace, you've created this thing, and it's kind of going to live forever. And so I think that that is interesting. And so, like here in the end, there's still a sliver of hope. I hold out my poem to you. Maybe, just maybe, your reading it will give it meaning and make it breathe again. It's like the poem is in this state of not being able to die, but also not really living. And I think that that's a neat idea. And then I say, I like the idea here, sort of. What can we say and hope for with death and failure, or death and failure? Like, it made me think about like how death, this might be a little bit complicated. When we write poetry, we're trying to express with language something usually that cannot really be expressed with language. I think that that is the purpose of poetry. It's kind of the purpose of all of our fictions and all of these things too. We want to explore things that we don't really have language for, and we use language to do it. And so I don't claim to be able to express exactly the idea that I feel this is sort of playing with, but I think it's kind of playing with this idea that what are we to do with sort of being born to fail? Does that make sense? Like the poem, I'm seeing the poem a little bit as a metaphor for our life. And I think that this is important. You know, this is, I write at the end, what is the poem a metaphor for, right? Because it has to, you know, the reader doesn't finally care about the poem, but we do get something from understanding that the poem is actually a metaphor for our life as it's lived. This made me think a little bit about how we're sort of born, right? And we're going to have this death. It's sort of like we're born into failure. And I feel like this poem flirts with that idea a little bit. And I think that that's pretty interesting. And I think that you kind of get to it even with your form by going down this line of how it's refused to pass on. And in a sense, the idea, the knowledge that you're bringing to this poem, once you've come to it, right? Once we think something, it can't be unthunk. Right, Ashwani?
Yes.
And
Sure.
that's one of the, I've noticed that so much in my own work. It's really what my writing ends up becoming, is it becomes this thing where I try to not inhibit myself as much as possible. I try to write things, in a sense, almost automatically. The writing of those things produces something that I'm not even aware of what it is. But once I've made it, I can't unmake it. I can't go backwards. It's a very, very intense, I mean, what you were possibly talking about here, and what I'm talking about in terms of my process, is a very intense way of living with the art of writing. I think it would also be true of living with any art, almost really living with any act of doing, right? We learn, we can't undo what we learn through our actions. So I think you have something really quite interesting here. I'm going to make cut, right? I'm going to go into a little slightly different issue. Okay, so I wrote poetry and I'm going to tell you the truth. You can write a poem quicker than you can write a short story. Okay. I don't care what the poets say. They're lying. They are lying. It's easier and quicker to write a poem. No doubt. Because a short story writer, we have to, if we have 5,000 words, we still have to get every single one of those 5,000 words to be right. There's no wrong word that's allowed in our story. One wrong word means the reader leaves, and we don't ever allow that. This poem maybe has not even 100 words. So it's easier to get 100 words right than it is to get 5,000 words right. I'm just going to say. This poem might take you, but I worked on poems for, let's say, 3 weeks or even a month. I would work on them for, I loved it. This crazy scrutiny, working on a poem. I could easily work on a poem that was, 150 lines long for, 6 hours a day. I was just, I grappling with each little thing. It's like, making this little gem. So you have to think about whether you want to do that. You have a draft of something. It's neat. I did it, but I'm finally not a poet. I published 6 poems. It's not the thing that I go to. I prefer, poems are intellectual, I think, mainly. Or there's a lot of intellectualism, and I think there's a lot to learn from them. But I really like writing narratives. I probably, in the end, I prefer imagining characters, their voices and their actions and their interactions more than I like just the sort of self-reflective thing that happens with poetry. So you all have to make a decision about that. If you were moving forward with this poem, the other thing about poetry is that poetry is one of those things where you sort of build a reputation. And you build a reputation by writing a lot of poems. So it becomes a kind of commitment. You can write one poem, maybe you could even publish it, but you're not going to have a reputation as a poet from that. You have to dedicate your life to it. I'm going to remind you that the poets live on the mountaintop in a dearth economy where they attack each other all the time. So
Got it.
you can think about where you want to live. I have a lot of funny stories about the differences between fiction writers and poets that I'll have to leave for another time. But if you were going to make this a poem, you want to try and develop a form and pattern for it. So it's the same with short stories. This is a little bit hard to, maybe a little bit hard to internalize, but like a short story has a form, right? And I've talked about like sort of what's necessary to do in the beginning, what you need to do in the middle, and what you do at the end. That is a form. Form creates energy because it's a kind of boundary that we work within, and also against. We push the form, and that gives our work energy. So in the short story, we have this form of beginning, middle, and end. Beginning doing what the beginning does, middle doing what the middle does, the duration of struggle, and the ending, which resolves the issue of the beginning, but also creates a kind of cyclical feeling. That's our form. Poems have exactly the same, poems have the same form. And they have the same kind of regularity, even more so because they're shorter. They become more constrained. And it's from working within the form that we actually achieve our energy and our creativity. You actually have the beginnings of a form here because you have this beginning, right? You have the beginning. Is it the right beginning? I'm not sure. You have the middle, right? You have the temple, you have the church, you have the crematorium. I guess this one is actually eight long, because I think these two go together. I'm not sure. And then you have something of the ending. So you have those things. But they're going to need some work so that they are really showing their form. You probably want to have stanzas. You either have to decide whether you want to have stanzas of equal length, whether you want to have what kind of rhyming, if you want to have any in there, which I would suggest don't. So most modern poets don't really work with rhyme because it's so hackneyed. But you still want to have alliteration and assonance within the work. And you want to have a more consistent form so that you're showing the boundaries that you're working within. I think it would be probably right in this poem to have, a form that the reader can perceive and even perceive the tensions of, because that's sort of what this piece is about. It's about it is a metaphor because those forms are the forms of sort of life. And you're basically asking this poem to stretch outside of that, but it's not really allowed to, right? So the form informs the poem itself and adds to it. It's a bit metaphysical. And the thing I know about your work, Ashvani, is that your work is very physical. This is something that I think about, right? So when I wrote poems, I would actually try and bring my sense of physicality into the poem and have it be filled with a lot of detail. This is really what's called, the metaphysical poets like John Donne. This is really a metaphysical poem because there's nothing really physical being discussed here. It's just ideas. It can be good, but I know that your style is a little bit more physical. So that's something for you to think about for yourself. I have a big problem with ideas. I have a big problem with ideas. I love to have them, but I recognize I don't love to read them. Because what I really want is to escape my world and go into another world. And for that, I need those physical details. And I think that that's what you are really so good at. So you want to weigh that for yourself and make a determination. Whatever we end up doing, I told my daughter this, is like, basically, life is about exploring something within a kind of constraint. You pick something, the earlier you pick it, the better, but it doesn't really matter. But you do something and you just keep doing it. That's the way you're going to actually learn about something in life. So if you want to pursue poetry, I've written in every form. So I don't know whether that was good or not, but choose what you want to do. We only have so much time and we want to set our priorities. But I think it's a really neat start, and I definitely really like the work as oh my God, I'm here, I have to write something. Otis is going to ask me to see my logbook. Okay, I'm going to write this, and I love that. And I think that is great. And I'm going to tell you truthfully, it's one of the things I did learn from writing poetry. In boxing, right? You train and you train and you train, but your coach will tell you at some point you have to let your hands go. And I think that is a great thing that poetry brought to me, was an understanding of how to let my hands go. Anyway, great work, Ashvani.
Thank you. Can I say something?
Sure.
I just wanted to say that when I wrote this poem, and before this also, once, several times I've made an attempt to write poetry. The good part about writing poetry is it feels good to write, and it feels good when I read it. And every time I read it, I want to make some change to it. And after I have made that change, when I read it again, it appears to be better than the earlier version. And so it goes on. It's more like an adventure or a video game kind of a thing, and not really trying to reach some predetermined kind of a destination or a target that, okay, now I have reached there. Somehow I never appear to reach anywhere. And it just goes around. Every time I read it and, add something or subtract something or change something, it looks better to me than the earlier one and gives me a great deal of satisfaction to have written it.
Well, I'll tell you that you sound like a writer. So Ernest Hemingway said, no work is ever finished, only abandoned. So we'll take that. That's the lesson. But I know exactly what you're talking about. I don't ever look at a single page that I've written and not make a change and think that it's better for the change. This is something we used to say in the fiction workshop, that you would write a draft of something, then you would start to revise it. And when you revised it so that it was exactly the same as the first draft, then you send it out to publish it.
Thank you, Otis. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ashwani. Ram, let's look at your work.
Sure.
Okay. Ram, tell us a little bit what's going on with this work.
Okay, so this actually, when I wrote the previous story of Sita's childhood, that's when a thought triggered that, okay, there are various aspects of Sita that are either misunderstood or we don't understand properly. So I thought, why not explore that through a series of either short stories or maybe novellas. This story, which I call the Greater Sita, is about the last part of Sita's life where she was banished by Rama. So she had stuck to Rama throughout his life, made sacrifices for him, and then in the end she is banished because of gossip and rumor, for which Rama is always held responsible. People blame Rama, how could he abandon her? But the interesting thing is Sita never once was bitter about it, nor did she ever blame or scold Rama for it. So there has to be some reason that sort of set me thinking what might have happened. And this is a story that tries to explore that. I have used an envelope structure here, where in the current contemporary context, there is a conversation that happens between two women, and that sort of tries to explore what happened with Sita. So that's the background to this. And this is the first part of that story. I expect that this will be probably a little longer than a short story, maybe a novella length, I don't know, maybe 7,000, 8,000 words. I'll have to see how it goes. I have not yet reached the end of it, still in the beginning.
Okay. I don't know what I have a conflict whether I should let you read or whether I should proceed just with my insightful comment.
Whatever you think is right.
I don't want to lose my insight.
Sure, please. I would love to hear your insight.
Maybe we better have you read.
Okay.
Let's have you read this first page.
I'll do that. Vaidehi clapped, her hands coming together slowly. Her eyes focused on the podium where Vasudha Maitreyi, the guest of honor, stood in the center of the stage, smiling. Vaidehi felt guilty for clapping slower than the rest of the crowd, most of who were on their feet, giving the speaker a standing ovation. Vaidehi squinted and got a better look at the guest of honor, who was standing in the center of the circle of yellow-orange light from the overhead lamps, her round face framed by frizzy streaks of grey. The only adornment on her face was a large red bindi and the Mangal Sutra of black beads around her neck. Vaidehi saw that Mrs. Maitreyi, as the guest was introduced, wore a spun cotton sari with a deep green and white pattern. How fitting, Vaidehi thought. Her name means the earth and she is wearing a green sari. Vaidehi was still clapping when she realized that the crowd around her had started dispersing. She looked back at the stage and saw that the organizers were escorting Mrs. Maitreyi off stage. I have to talk with her, Vaidehi thought. She walked sideways and the edges of the seats knocked on her knees. Mrs. Maitreyi was disappearing into the side wings of the stage. Vaidehi raced along the aisle. The stage was cordoned off with a row of potted plants. Maybe I can squeeze through the gaps, she thought, and shuffled forward. Something pushed against her leg. She pushed her leg against the obstruction and heard a clank. A concealed chain. She looked up at the stage. The last of the organizers escorting Mrs. Maitreyi had disappeared through a dimly lit door. Can I jump over it? Vaidehi thought. She heard a rustle. Damn this sari, she cursed. She saw a door next to the stage. A lighted exit sign was above the door. A few rich-looking people stood there chatting. Why they he hurried towards the door. Otis, I can't hear you.
Oh, that's because I muted myself while you were reading. Okay, so something that I notice, as you're reading this is, and I think that this is true of your style. I was talking about, Ashvani's, love of the physical in his writing. And I think it's important for us as writers to recognize what we love to write. And you seem to me to love to write these characters in action. We have this character here that has gone to this talk, and someone has given the talk, and she's there and she's thinking, and you really construct this really vivid scene. And it's not just a vivid scene, it's also one in which this character is doing a lot. And I see that you really enjoy that, and I also appreciate that as a reader because I end up being able to participate in that scene. The other thing that I think you do is this piece, maybe like the last piece, is that you have an agenda, a kind of intellectual agenda of what you want to do. And like, as you're saying here, like you want to write a story about Sita, and you're trying to basically find a way to do that.
That's true.
And I think that's, so I'm going to say something, I'm not sure whether it's complex or not, but like at the end of this piece, I wrote, it seems like maybe it's another straw man again. Mm-hmm. It's like, there's a very sincere construction here of, constructing this woman in the beginning. The woman in the beginning would normally in a story be the protagonist. So I think we have to talk about what a protagonist is.
Okay.
But we'll put that aside for a second. But she's basically being placed as a protagonist, but you're actually using her as kind of a straw man who is going to essentially hear a story from the higher power.
True.
Which is this woman who's on stage. And so you do a lot here in the beginning, really constructing that higher power, which is this other woman, why she's insightful, while she's great, while she's, a sage who can speak to all of this thing, and that is a little bit of what it is kind of a bait and switch.
Okay.
Because what usually happens in stories is that you present a protagonist, and the thing is, we're very used to stories. Human beings have basically evolved with stories since the time of the first language, whatever that language was, even marks, even just vocalization. They've been stories, right? We've created this abstract world. So we've evolved with stories. So we have certain expectations. Normally with stories, we present a protagonist, and then that's the character that we basically ally ourselves with, because we understand their external struggle and we understand their internal struggle. And then really the definition of the protagonist is that they're proactive in regard to achieving what they want. They're proactive even if what they're doing is running away. Right? They want to flee, they're proactive in fleeing. They want to challenge, they're proactive in challenging. They want to love, they're proactive in loving. Whatever it is, they're proactive about it. They're the protagonist.
Mm.
This piece actually makes, is it Matri?
Maitri,
anyway,
yeah.
Matri. She's actually the protagonist.
That's right.
Right? And
yeah.
And you see, the thing is, so I want to go back to what you do. You love writing these characters that are doing things, right? But they're in a sense, they're little marionettes. you're actually aligned with Mrs. Matri as the protagonist.
Right.
So I'm going to say something. I'm going to say something kind of complex. You know, as you were reading, I was thinking about. So it's an envelope. It's basically, you know, kind of a story. You know, a story within a story, a play within a play. It's a very
Right.
common form. One of the most famous, as you probably know, is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Heart of Darkness is basically a story told by Marlowe out aboard a boat in the Thames to the person who's the narrator. So there's a narrator there, and Marlowe basically tells the whole story. At the end of that story, we return to the Thames, and then the narrator says one little thing.
Mm-hmm.
But in that story, there's a narrator, but Marlowe is really the protagonist. And his protagonism is that he has to tell the story.
Okay.
I guess it's sort of a vague idea. Let's say that's just informing me somehow. I don't exactly know how. But I think what you might need to do is you need to write the protagonist. So what you're doing now is you're basically hiding the protagonist, which is you, right? You have, I'm going to say you have an agenda, right? And you are trying to hide the fact that you have an agenda with all of this, song and dance, a dog and pony show, as we like to say. And so there's a dog and pony show where you're hiding your agenda. And I think instead what you need to do is you need to take that out and say, okay, I'm going to make the protagonist the person who's leading my agenda. I want to make my agenda, this need to tell the story, I want to put that into the character of the protagonist. I'm going to say something complex, Ram. I'll see if my brain can contain it. But the way you're writing this story now means that you're not going to really challenge yourself with the story, because you never have to explore why the person has to tell it, because you're telling it from the straw man's point of view. Mm-hmm. You're basically telling the story of this woman who's sitting here in the audience. She has to hear this story.
Right.
But you don't really have to challenge why she has to hear that story. It's just that she has to, according to you, right? She has to hear it. That's the construction. You get a much different problem if you take the protagonist as the person who must tell the story. Then we have the problem of, why does she have to tell it?
Okay.
And that is the issue with Marlowe. The issue with Marlowe is, why does he have to tell it? If you did that, you see the problem, Ram, this gets to like the biggest thing, like that I always say, like when we write a story, we create a construction, and what happens in our construction is that it leads us somewhere. It leads us to a discovery of a territory we don't know going in. It forces us to answer a question that we don't want to even ask. This is a little bit what you're avoiding.
That is true.
Which is kind of an examination of your own agenda. Why do you have to tell this story? You are going to be able to get closer to answering that question if you make the protagonist someone who is, in a sense, like you. But you have to make, now that we say that, and I'm talking about the spirit, I'm not talking about the physical characteristics by any means. You see yourself as the protagonist, right? I'm a writer. I am a protagonist in my own story. We're all protagonists in our own story. I want something, and I try to do it, and I try to do it through writing. So you're going to ally that sort of drive with your protagonist, whatever it is that their drive is. Their drive could be to rob a bank, right? In this case, it is to tell this story, which is very aligned with your, your purpose. But that is the energy that we take and we try and explore with. It's in fact, it goes back to that universal connection. The writer has a universal connection with their protagonist, and so does the reader. And that is the bond between all three of us. The reader to the character to the author. We are actually all the same, and we're all headed towards the same difficult journey. A difficult journey of discovery, a difficult journey of the discovery of being the protagonist and wanting something and having the world not wanting to give it to us.
That makes sense.
That is the story, right? That is the story. And it's one that the writer has to suffer through, just like their protagonist. And if the connection is very strong between, and it should be, ideally it is. We're not trying to be hacks, right? There are definitely hack writers who, they don't care. They can write infinite numbers of, family dramas and whatever. But we're not trying to do that, I don't think. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to take myself to some place, to a point of discovery, and I use stories to do that. If we construct that, then we have that discovery, the character has that discovery and a choice, and the reader also goes along through a verisimilitude of that struggle and arrives at a place where they too can think about, what choice would I make? So this is all a long way to say, can you construct this story so that a character like Mrs. Mitria is the protagonist?
No, that makes sense.
Because I'm trying to work with you, right? I'm not trying to work against you. I'm not trying to make you actually humanize and sort of enliven. The objective would be, throughout my reading of this the first time, I was looking at your principal character and I was saying, this story is not being directed by her actions or what she wants. I was like, what is her internal struggle? What is she trying to get? And then if she's trying to get something, the objective of story is not to give it to her, right? The objective of story isn't like, I need to hear the story of Sita. Oh, well, let me tell it to you. That is not a story. That is, I lost my wallet. I thought it was at the restaurant. I went to the restaurant and there was my wallet. That is not a story. A story is about characters wanting something and not getting it. I think that one of the, if I were considering this story, I would think about having the person who's telling me the story basically bringing us this story, not bringing it to us through, let's say, mythology and over the course of years and culture and all of that. I would think about having her somehow able to have an actual access to the true story of Sita. I don't see, in writing we can do we can do anything, right? We have a lot of capability. So let's go back to the story of Heart of Darkness. We have a narrator, and we don't even really know who that narrator is, except for that they're on the boat. And they're on the boat, and they're a person like us. And then we have Marlowe, who is driven to tell the story of Kurtz. You can construct something similar, but you're not making, so in Conrad, he does not make this narrator who hears the story, right? They're not really the protagonist. They're simply the chronicler of the tale that's being told to them. The drive of that tale is Marlowe's. Marlowe is the protagonist throughout that entire story. And what we finally discover is we discover something about Marlowe. We don't discover something about Kurtz. Kurtz says the horror. That's not what we discover. What we discover, that's the superficial thing that we might discover, and it's the thing that everyone latches onto, which is actually, unfortunately, so, I want to say, stupid. You know, it's like that's just a ridiculous idea by Kurtz. That's nothing. What we really learn about is the journey of Marlowe, where he returns from the heart of darkness and then has to speak to the fiancée at the end. And he lies, and he believes that the world will crumble because of his lie, and the world does nothing. That is the journey. Because the world doesn't respond to the protagonist's want of having some kind of order and justice in the universe. And discovering that is the story. And that's, sorry, I'm saying discovering that is the story, but what we're really discovering is the human spirit, the drive of the human spirit, the need for us to have some kind of order and sense of truth in a universe which really doesn't provide it for us. Right? That's Heart of Darkness, it seems to me. You have maybe a similar task here with this protagonist.
Right.
The question being, what and why does she have this drive to tell this story? You construct it, you engage in it, and try and discover it. And in doing that, you then discover in yourself why you have that drive. And what you come up with might not be altogether comfortable.
Yeah.
It doesn't allow us to have that sort of aloof position of, you know, I know what truth is. We don't know what truth is. We're human. You know, we you know, we don't get to be like, you know, the puppet master that makes everyone work the way we want them to work and accept the truths that we want them to accept, because we don't get to do that. What we do is we get to take the spotlight and beam it inward. And what we get to say about truth is the truth of the human, you know, the human animal that we are, and our great need. That's what we get to comment on, because it's kind of the only thing we know.
So this is I think
Anyway,
true,
that's a long.
because no, this is true because when I thought about it after hearing you, yeah, it makes sense, because currently what is happening is there is a story that I want to tell. This is a story from the epics, which I'm putting in an envelope structure in a current narrative with Maitreyi as the protagonist. And then on top of that, there is another layer of this woman Vaidehi who is going to her and listening the story. So that is sort of jumbling it up. And like you said, yeah, it is the story of this woman Maitreyi that is important. So that's what needs to come to the front. It's sort of like the way the current structure is almost like an apology.
Yeah, and it's also like I say, it's a little bit of a bait and switch. It doesn't really put the pressure on Maitreyi, right?
Yeah.
Normally in the story, the pressure is all on her because she's the one who wants something.
Yes.
And you know, and wanting, you know, it becomes a, I don't know, I think it's a brilliant thing, like wanting to tell the story. What is that want? Right? And that's something that we as storytellers know somehow, but we don't often reflect upon. What is our drive to tell the story? And that's what you would end up exploring through this character. And that's what we do. I mean, that becomes a little bit, you know, circular, but that's what we end up doing. we end up exploring why characters want something and why they try to make it happen.
Because I think unless her drive to tell the story comes out on the page, that commitment will not be there for the reader to read the story either. I think it's I can sort of connect it to that example that you give of, the bear at the tent. It's putting the bear at the table or talking about the bear at the table.
Yeah.
So this is talking about the bear at the table.
I would try to construct. Right. This is. They have a lot of stories that have these titles like the sword maker's daughter, or the wizard's handmaiden, or something like that. That's a little bit what you have, because the character of Matri, the way those stories kind of work, it seems to me, is you create the person who's at the side of this other person. And it ends up discussing both this other person, let's say the king's daughter. We'll just say the king's daughter, okay? So the king's daughter becomes a construction that allows you to talk about the king, but also really talk about the king and what it ends up meaning for the person who's telling the story. They're the protagonist. Right. And it becomes a comment about the story of the king. And it has to do with what their life is like, and what this person's life is like, the famous person, right? It would be Sita in your story, right? And also the life of the person who feels the need to tell and somehow contain the story of Sita. Yeah. Because it has some need for them. That we do not know what that need is until we really get to the end. That's the discovery. And it's the discovery of that need that actually informs the reader. So yes, we get the story, like in Heart of Darkness, we get the story of Marlowe. We get the story of Kurtz. But the story of Kurtz is not the story of the Heart of Darkness. So in the same way that the king's daughter, we get the story of the king, but that's not the story. The story is the daughters. In your case, it could be like, Sita's handmaiden, right? So instead of Mrs. Matri, right, as a sage, she is a handmaiden or something, right? Or she's, right. Whoever, you construct a character. But then, like Heart of Darkness, you need to take this character and somehow bring them out into the world. Going back to Heart of Darkness and that structure, we have Marlowe. Marlowe goes on a trip. We hear about it. That is the story. But we have a way to bring that story out into the world. He's on the boat in the Thames. And that has meaning too. I think at the end, it's like this too has been one of the dark places on Earth, right? The fact is, it still is. So let's forget about has been. There's no has been. It is. London, come on, give me a break. The horror. But anyway, there's a way to take it out and bring it and bring it out into the world as a stepping stone to the reader. And you can think about that too, right? So the character of Mrs. Matri could be, you can do anything you want. She could be 4,000 years old. Or you could go back in time and she could be ancient and this person is, back in this time period. You can do whatever you want, but you need to figure out how to do it. So like in Heart of Darkness, the time parameters are not as broad because, let's see, Conrad wrote that probably 20s. I don't know. I'm not sure. 28 maybe. So he is dealing with fairly recent history in the Congo. And then he's coming out to the Thames that's only, let's say, we can imagine is just a few years maybe after Marlowe has taken this trip. You have a much broader time span to bring the story to us. So you have to figure out some kind of construction. That's just thinking, right? That's just a conceit. to bring it to us.
Hmm.
Um,
No, I can see what I need to do, because in the current construct, the reader is being shown a story, whereas what I need to do is to put the reader in the story. So in the current construct, the reader is only being shown the story.
Right. And what that means is you have to put yourself in the story.
Yeah.
Because it's the same thing that puts the reader in the story is the same thing that would put you in the story. It's all the same. You have to let the protagonist actually struggle.
Because it's essentially by starting just one thought that is like flitting across my mind. So in the case of this story, the way I have written it, because I have started with this woman Vaidehi who is hearing the speech, etc., I am putting the reader in the seat next to her, so the reader is hearing the story. Whereas if I make Maitreyi the protagonist and she tells the story, and there is a drive for her to tell the story, then what I'm doing is I'm putting the reader in a seat next to the protagonist, who is Maitreyi, and then the reader is in the story.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm making sense, but yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
I don't know if you're making sense either, but I can tell that you're making sense to yourself, and that's what's important.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
I could see a rather fascinating. Ram, remind me. I feel like you have some sages who have like very, very long lives.
Sure, they do. Yeah.
Like 2,000 years. Something like that. If you wanted to bring this story into the modern world, I would think of a construction in which maybe your character who needs to tell the story is like a handmaiden or something like that. And she's become a sage. And let's say she's been found, they found her in a cave. She didn't even need any water, or, you make it a bit magical, right?
Right.
And now you have some reporter who's going to interview her, right? I mean, you're just talking about creating a construction. These little things, the conceit of the story, it's just something that we do. It's an intellectual activity. And the way you do it is very interesting to people. And it's a nice place to be kind of bold and then, do something far more interesting, show that you have some freedom and like some guts, in a way to not inhibit yourself to do something that's sort of a little bit outrageous,
Sure.
Because that gets people's attention,
Sure.
2,000-year-old woman found in cave, right? Okay, that's pretty. 2,000-year-old woman found in cave. I love it already, but it's like we need to deal with the problems. But you see, like I take Heart of Darkness as my example. The problems that we're dealing with are, like I said to Ashvani, short stories also have very much their form, and we have to work within it. And the challenge is to accept that we have this form and then see what we do. Shakespeare in his sonnets might have come up with a word that has, that defies the iambic pentameter in the line that he must defy it in, right? Maybe you do it by understanding that you have this constraint, so you have to have a 2,000-year-old woman found in cave. This is what we do.
So actually, the reason, I find that thought very intriguing and interesting, but I will probably not put a 2,000-year-old sage, and I'll tell you the reason for that. I call it the two-headed chicken construct. So if I open a newspaper, and on the front page there are two articles, right? One says that, okay, there's a drought in Congo and then 10 million people died. And right next to it, there's an article that says two-headed chicken hatched in a village, right? So people are going to read that article which says two-headed chicken hatched. So that sort of takes the focus away from the more important issues. So in this, I have a construct in mind. I know how I want to tell the story, but what I need to change is the frame of the story. So I'm not going to go for the two-headed chicken construct. I know what I need to do. I really know what I need to do. And thank you very much for this. This is the difference between seeing a story and being in a story. So this is like really insightful. I'm actually quite excited.
Good. I hope you won't throw away, I appreciate everything people do. Our main job is to grab the reader by the throat and then do not let go. That is our job. We have one job. So I have no problem with a two-headed chicken.
No, I agree.
If the two-headed chicken grabs the throat of the reader, then so be it.
Maybe I say that a two-headed chicken hatched in Congo, and in that village 10 million people died because of the drought. So then maybe the reader will read the article. Who knows?
Okay, I let two-headed chicken found in village. I actually like that title. I'm going to sketch that one for one of my own works. Okay, but thank you, Ram. It's again, we discover everything by getting those words on the page, and we learn so much from it. So this is good. I'll tell you the way I got to this, though, just for the secret for all of us. What does the character want and why? We need to know that about our protagonist. And then we need to see them making actions to get what they want. We both know that they want something, and we know why, which is the internal struggle. So the external struggle is what they want. The internal struggle is why. They're usually achieving the external struggle does not solve the internal struggle. I'm telling you. So that's not going to happen. Because the story is not about characters getting what they want. It's about what happens when the character doesn't get what they want. And that's why it's the triumph of the human spirit. Characters getting what they want is not a triumph of the human spirit. Yeah. This is what we have to know about our protagonists. Each and every one of us should try to understand clearly and precisely what they want. We should try to reveal the internal struggle, which is why they want it. That's the drive of character. And when I read this piece, I saw who you were presenting as the protagonist, but I didn't see any actions being driven by what she wants, even though she was doing things. And I didn't understand why she wanted it, so I had no connection to it. And that's the first, that was the thing that tipped me off. And then when I look at it and I see Miss Matri, who's a secondary character, I see that she wants something, actually. She wants to tell this story. And then I'm sort of like, wait a second. Ram also wants to tell this story.
Yes.
Very curious.
You got that. You got me.
Okay, well, I think I don't see Vandana, who gave me a short piece also today. So I think that's a wrap.
So thank you very much for this. This has been extremely revealing. This has been very, very useful. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Ram. Thank you, Ashwani, for sending in your pieces. And hopefully I will, rather than won't or can't, I will send in a piece for next Sunday. And folks, please also do send in your pieces, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank you, Otis. Thank you, Abhinav.
Otis, thanks, Abhinav.